quite a different presentation from the last one. Oh, I need to speak into the mic. Okay.
And, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's so we can pick up.
So I gave this presentation about a week and a half ago in the UK at RSA Europe. Went over pretty well. It's a very different presentation from the last one. But what we tried to do is we've had a list of what we call the top 10 biggest database problems, issues that you need to think about, worry about when it comes to managing a database from a security perspective. The problem is that when you present that list, it sometimes can seem a little abstract and a little bit difficult to identify with, because like, wow, how could that actually work in reality? So what we did is we took that list and we applied that to actual database breaches that occurred in 2011. And so we looked at just I have two people who look at these things, and we kept a catalog of breaches over the past year. So this actually has up-to-date breaches. The most recent one was like 2-3 weeks ago. And so then each of these things actually has a specific incident that we bring it back up to. So I mentioned in my last talk that data has value. This is actually something from 2000 this year, but it's from October 2nd. And so there you have this website, ssn.dob.biz. And in this case, that last one I showed credit card numbers from a Russian forum. This is an English forum. They're selling visas for US Visa for $2, a UK Amex and Discover for $6. EU Visa goes for $6. So 3 times more valuable. And this is pretty recent, obviously. Then I talked a lot about insider threats, and I gave you those 2 sets of surveys that we did, China and London. In this case, what we did is we tried to say, okay, well, how do you understand the insider threat? And there's really we defined 3 things. The main one being access levels, because insiders by definition have trust in access, right? And it's just a matter of how much access you give somebody, and that can be commensurate with the amount of damage that they can potentially cause. Another factor is technical skills. So typically, most insiders have very low technical skills. They're not terribly skilled people. But on occasion, you get somebody like the guy from UBS or the guy from Societe Generale who used to be an IT person and then understood the IT infrastructure so well when he became a trader that he could bypass all of the application controls and all the controls, and in that case cost $7 billion worth of damage. And then there's motivation. Motivation is probably the most complicated one to understand, because that's one that has there's so many different ones. And one lady pointed out earlier that, what about non-malicious ones? We call that the compromised insider. It may have been a spear phishing attack, it may have been lost stuff on a laptop, whatever. But you look at all these different motivations. Accidental is a better example of lost laptop, but coolness. Somebody has so many devices because they want to be cool. They have an iPad, they have an iPod, they've got all this stuff, and they start storing corporate data on it. Ideology, that's WikiLeaks. I mentioned the It's Mine in my last talk. You just work with the data. This is actually pretty common with a lot of sales guys who build up their sales leads and build up that database, so when they go to another company, they just take that with them. Revenge. This isn't a database example, but I like it because it's just funny. One IT guy managed to, after he was fired, he still had control of the remote desktop tool in Microsoft. And so he accessed the CEO's PowerPoint presentation to the board of directors and inserted a bunch of pornographic photos. So when he presented to the board of directors, some photos came up that, let's just say, they didn't relate to earnings. Yeah.
There was a guy at the stock exchange about 30 years ago. His wife got a raise and he didn't. They were both working at the company. Mm-hmm. He took down the stock market 10 times before we got him on videotape.
Nice. Very nice.
The whole stock market.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'm being recorded. I shouldn't say that's awesome.
It was awesome.
That was not awesome. That was terrible.
It was awesome.
Productivity. So sometimes, you don't want to do something bad, but what you're doing, and this actually happens quite a bit in the medical industry, where you just download a bunch of patient data because you want to go home and work on it, right? So you take it out of the applications, you want to update, oh, we gave this person a test, we gave that person this test, and so forth. And so you take it home, and then you have the intention of uploading it later, because doing it while you're connected or at the office is kind of a pain in the butt. I mentioned the profit motivation. This is probably the biggest one, obviously. In the case of Disney, that was one of them. And then there's curiosity. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the curious insider. My favorite example, this actually happened on my same floor as I did, because we use the same bathrooms. But there was a layoff at a company completely unrelated to my industry at a previous company I was working with, and somebody from HR got let go. So they went into the men's room and they posted up the salary of everybody at the company inside the men's room. Anyways, for the people that were left over at that company, there was quite a disparity. I mean, even I didn't know who these people were, but it was kind of interesting to see the disparity. And then compromise insider. This actually, I spoke a second about it, but this is becoming a really, really big deal. We had, on Monday, released a report on hacker forums. And we put out a video on it as well. It's just a short, like 5-minute video explaining how hacker forums work and some of the key statistics that we got from it. Hackers were really pissed off at us. I mean, really pissed off. They tried to DDoS our website. And then one of our employees, there's some debate whether it was spear phishing or not, and whether it was related to this specific incident, but it's a good example. They think that she was spear phished as a result of the revenge for looking at Stephanie, by the way, for those of you who work at Imperva. And so anyways, the poor girl's computer has been shut down for the last 5 days. That's how they think the RSA breaches happened, was through spear phishing. So these are non-malicious people who are just clicking on things they shouldn't be. So I talk about hackers, I talk about insider. What's the IT security perspective of it? We did a survey in 2010, roughly a year ago, with Securosis, which is a security analyst firm. One guy's a former Gartner dude. But basically it breaks down as a third. A third are concerned about hackers, a third of your concerns about malicious insider, and then the balance is non-malicious insiders. At first I thought, well, geez, there's a lot more hacking incidents. Shouldn't that be higher up? But then you realize, well, actually, the kind of damage that an insider can do, it might be lower frequency, but it's sort of like, flying. Statistically, it's safe, but when something happens, it's going to be ugly. And I think that explains the numbers here. So let's take a look back at data breaches. And the first view I took is data breach volume. So those of you familiar with privacyrights.org, they have a great website. You can just pull down data breach information until you're sick of it. So 2009, huge volume of breaches, 250 million records. And then obviously we're doing a great job because the volume dropped a lot. And then in 2011, it's gone up a little bit. But in reality, if you look at the numbers a different way, basically there was 2 mega breaches. Heartland and Veterans Affairs hospitals, where there was a lost laptop. If you strip that out, there's actually a 26% decline from just this portion here to that portion there. So basically what we're not seeing anymore is mega breaches. Now Sony arguably was a mega breach this year. Privacy Rights makes the point that they don't include the 100 million from Sony because only 12 million were unencrypted. The other, 70, 80 million records were encrypted. So they don't count those as a proper, they don't count those towards the final number. But I think if you look at the numbers a different way, you get a different story, and one that explains things a lot more clearly. So what we're seeing is more incidents. So 2009, 250, and then we doubled. And by the way, these are all American numbers because they don't include foreign numbers. So another reason why Sony wasn't included, because a lot of it took place in Japan, for example. And then so far we're on par to be about the same with respect to last year. I think we'll probably end up beating 2010. So what we're seeing is just a rising number of breaches, and it kind of makes sense. So our Hacker Forum report showed a big increase in the number of discussions around hacking. It showed a lot of people learning and participating in tutorials about hacking. So it's kind of like a shark's jaw. You know, even as the teeth go away, there's like 2 teeth in the back waiting to pop out. So it's just something that's growing and becoming bigger. The Verizon data breach report made an interesting point, which is something we talk a lot about. Well, you can automate hacking. And so not only more people doing it, but they're doing it with an automated tool. So instead of everyone having a pea shooter, a lot of people are having semi-automatics, or they're having automatics. And so you can do a lot more damage with that. With respect to insiders, it looked like, according to Verizon data breach report, that insider threats actually did not go up. But the problem was that hacking went up so much because of the automation that it just made insiders look steady state, so to speak. But in fact, the insider threat really actually did go up. I think it was roughly by 17% in terms of total number of incidents. So we're going to look at the top 10 database breaches. So these are things that specifically relate to the database. So a lot of these are insider threats. In fact, the majority are insider threats. What I'm going to do is go through each incident, talk a little bit about what the factors were, and so forth. Number 10 was Bank of America. This happened in May. Relatively small breach, only quote-unquote 300 records. What happened in this case is that one guy on the inside, a customer service rep, was pulling down a bunch of customer information because they had access to account balances and all the various bits of information you see here. And what they were doing is working with an outside criminal group to basically siphon the funds off of customers. So they would recognize, okay, so-and-so, Mr. Smith has, you know, say there was actually a very specific person who had like 26,000, 30,000, something like that in their bank account, and then all of it got taken down. And it got so complex to the point where the rep would change the address for the customer temporarily for like a day or two, so that he would then go in and then change the address, or make a request for checks. Okay, and then those checks would arrive at that bogus address, which was actually a real address, but that would go to the criminals, who then would write the checks using those things. And then he would change the address back to the person's normal home address. And that's how they would go about and siphon the funds. So here you have something where it shows excessive privilege abuse. They're basically just giving too much stuff. So we see this quite a bit. So users are granted database privileges in excess of their business need to know. They shouldn't have, in this particular case, this person should not have had that much access to all this information. The problem you have here is it's really hard to get, and it's really difficult for a lot of people to identify what is the right set of privileges that people should have. It's a very complicated thing. So ACL's access control list, sometimes they're also very limited. So you might build a database, you might build an application, and give people certain privileges, but it's hard to know, especially with a database, what's the right set of things to do, or the database may not support the right way to do it. And so, of course, any minor incident can become a pretty big one. Next one is UCLA.
Something like to Bank America. I went to Bank America to open an account, and their PC was showing up all kinds of strange stuff, which they said, oh, it's not working. But they took all the Social Security and everything. And the second day, I gave them the $20,000 check for the saving thing. And the second day I went there, they did not. The first day they told me they have opened an account for me. The second day I went there, the account doesn't exist. And so the situation is just like exactly what you say. Mm-hmm. And then I talked to the branch manager, and she said, "Oh, that person, she has been working here for 2 years. I have complete trust in her."
Ah, right, nice. Yeah. So, speaking of complete trust, let's talk about UCLA. So, in this case, you had what we call legitimate privilege abuse. There was also some illegitimate privilege abuse where some doctors and not doctors, but mostly nurses and other staff were taking celebrity medical records and just looking into them, saying, "Oh, George Clooney's in town," or whatever is around. Let's take a look at it and see what's going on. But in this case, Michael Jackson's information was sold by hospital staff to the media right about the time when he passed away. And this year, they had to pay, UCLA had to pay fines of about $1 million. So this is what we call legitimate privilege abuse. So you have an abuse of legitimate database privileges for unauthorized purposes. So you have total normal ability to do what you're supposed to do, but you shouldn't be doing it for those purposes. For the record, on my flight out here, Air Force One was at San Francisco Airport right about the time I was about to take off. So this is my little bit of revenge. It was actually cool to see Air Force One, though. Okay, so legitimate privilege abuse. You use simple available desktop tools. You can retrieve a large amount of data. And then you can store a lot of it locally. You can do it on a phone, laptop, whatever. And then worse, you can make unauthorized changes. So obviously you can have a lot of data theft, loss, and embezzlement. This is a big deal. So Oak Ridge National Labs. This is a case of spear phishing. We talked a little bit about that before. But in this case, they're not quite completely sure who did it. Probably some foreign government, but could not necessarily be a foreign government. What happened was a file went to 520-something internal users, internal people at the labs. Roughly 250 to 300 of those clicked on a file and said, "Here's important HR information about your benefits." And it was a fake Excel file, and basically, it was something that would, it was a combination of keyloggers and all this other fun things to basically help them, help the perpetrators take information. In this case, they took information from a database that was obviously credentials, but they also managed to take some IP as well. They also shut down some of the supercomputers. They have some supercomputers that do all kinds of interesting things. But this is a case where you have a compromised insider who isn't necessarily, a bad person, but what they've done is that, in this case, somebody external has elevated their privileges. So it could be internal, it could be external in general, who raises their privilege levels, and they could. They've done this through either poor password or, in this case, it was a case of stolen credentials. So, some cases you can do this through something fairly technical by manipulating SQL statements. But again here, minor things can become fairly major. This is actually, of course, what happened with RSA. In that case, it was extremely significant breach, and they're still paying the price for that one. And then, of course, a lot of your built-in security controls become ineffective. In this case, understanding how people work with data. This is also how Stuxnet worked, by the way. So the feeling with Stuxnet was probably done on a USB drive. Went inside, started manipulating things, particularly how one of the ways the Stuxnet virus worked was there's a fixed coded password that would write information about the nuclear power plant to the database in terms of water temperature and all that stuff. If you try to change that password, it would freeze the database access, and that's one of the things that it actually did. And so when it tried to change that fixed password, it would actually freeze up and seize up, and that was one of the technical innovations of Stuxnet. Which, by the way, if they gave out Nobel Prizes for malware, Stuxnet really should win. Medical records relief. I was actually in Chicago in September. I picked up the Chicago Tribune, and this is one of the incidents that appeared in the paper that day. 300,000 medical records were actually posted up online, and nobody is quite sure where they came from. Okay, so nobody necessarily knew whereabouts they came from, but what the Chicago Tribune did, although I think the article was actually written by Bloomberg, is they actually focused on what could be done with the medical records. And so they mentioned, well, criminals can blackmail or participate in public humiliation because they could access medical records. In this case, what happened was that one guy, he knew his medical records were compromised, and he had to go out and get like LifeLock and all this other stuff. But what they also pointed out was the fact that non-criminals can use this type of information. Insurance companies or employers could inflate rates, or employers could deny jobs to applicants. I thought it was interesting and significant because this is one of the first, if not the first, most comprehensive breach of major medical records. And why this is significant, especially for those of us, when I gave this talk in the UK, this actually held a lot of, they can identify with, because the NHS, the National Health Service, is notorious for losing medical records and, in the UK. In fact, at one point they asked, there was a headline, who's crappier, Sony or the NHS? And that's literally the headline. But what it does is it foreshadows the problems with broader digitization of electronic health records. By 2013 or 14, I think it's by 2014, under the healthcare law, all electronic records have to be digitized. I think that's a really, really bad idea. But what this also, I think, pointed out was the fact that nobody knew where it came from. They think it probably came from partner, because a lot of, in healthcare, you've got pharmaceuticals, you've got hospitals, you've got doctors, you've got insurance companies, you have a lot of different partners. There's a lot of digital information sharing. The ability to audit that kind of stuff and know where it's going. Oh, I gave it to so-and-so at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday. That's important stuff to know. The problem with audits is they're difficult. So audit policies, you have to rely on built-in database mechanisms to do that. One of our customers, their actual email signature, I'm not making this up, and God I trust, for everyone else I keep log files. I love that. The problem you have with auditing is a lot of people don't do it. Performance degradation due to turning that on, people worry about that. You don't know what matters in a mountain of data. That's a really difficult thing to do. There's limited granularity. You might audit a whole bunch of stuff, but you need to know, let's say, some specific column level stuff within a database. Not necessarily easy to do. If you're using a bunch of different databases, there's different proprietary ways of understanding what's in each of those databases. And then, of course, you're vulnerable to various database attacks, so things could get changed. And then you may not have end-to-end user tracking. So these are some of the issues with auditing. Let me explain the end-to-end user tracking problem in a little bit more detail. There's something called connection pooling. Get a bunch of people, they access the database. In order to keep performance up, the database creates a pool. So it doesn't identify, this is Joe, this is Fred, this is Larry, they're accessing it. It just says there's somebody accessing it. So you don't know who is specifically accessing it. So that becomes a little bit more difficult to understand that. Oops. So the issue here with auditing is it's very complex to do, and it's difficult, but it's also really important, especially I think in medical industry, they're going to have to really keep their ball on that. And the same thing, by the way, happened with Stanford University. But in the case of Stanford University, they lost 20,000 database records, full medical records of a bunch of their customers. In that case, at least, they were able to identify that it was a specific partner. So it was one of their business partners, one of their outsourcers who was tasked with managing things. And that way they were able to say, okay, it was this particular person, so they were actually could point their finger at somebody. But in this particular case, they couldn't point their finger at anybody. Okay, Groupon India. This is an interesting one. So this is where you accidentally create a bunch of information and then make it. In this case, they made it public because they were making unauthorized copies of data. In this case, it was the Groupon subsidiary in India, 300,000 user passwords. They were unencrypted. This happened in June. And what they ended up doing is accidentally putting this file with the usernames and passwords on the internet. So somebody made a copy of it and then, presumably by accident, left it on one of their servers. So it was publicly exposed. The reason why it was found out is because a researcher, security guy out of Australia, was just simply searching for information and accidentally happened onto this particular site and then reported it, and nobody knows how many people, bad people, possibly looked at it. And it could be zero, could be a lot. But it also kind of highlights the issue with and the role that Google plays when it comes to hacking, because it's becoming an extremely, if not, one of the most valuable tools when it comes to hacking. So this is my little UK joke right here, because what happened was, I think this is the Minister of Defense or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
So he had some important, like, Afghanistan or Iraq documents here. This thing folded over, and then the journalists took pictures of this, and they were able to zoom in on what the war plans were.
It's coming out from talking to the Prime Minister.
I'm sorry?
That's 10 Downing Street.
That's right. This is at 10 Downing Street. This is literally like a few feet away from the front door. So sensitive data is copied to new databases without a particular person held responsible, or sometimes without even the knowledge of people doing it. So, when one of the key things for security is knowing what you don't know. When a database is copied without this security team's knowledge, that's not a good thing. And then, of course, you may not apply some of the right security controls when you're doing that type of thing. So sensitive data is sitting out there on the wire somewhere without security's knowledge, and you don't know who could be accessing it. Okay. Number 5 is Suncoast. And this is quite an interesting one. So in this case, oops, what happened there? I think something happened when I went to the older version of Windows, so sorry about that. This is a denial of service. So typically we think of a denial of service as, like an anonymous or a lulsec just hammering a website, hammering a network and flooding it to the point where it can't work anymore. Well, there's a database denial of service, not to be confused with the other form of DDoS. In this case, an IT employee was let go. She wasn't too happy, and they killed her access to the network and to various applications, but what they didn't do is they didn't kill her access to one component of the network, and so she was able to go in and change the database passwords. And so nobody could access the database from any of the applications. So it was a very clever manipulation of database access. So she was actually sentenced this year. So technically this happened at the very end of December of last year, but I'm squeezing this in this year. Because it's it's funny, B, it's a good illustration of what this is. So denial of service here. We see actually a number of different ways in which this could happen. But essentially it's denying legitimate access to something. And you can do it through vulnerabilities, you can play with the data, or you can do, in this case, playing with the resources. Accessing data is critical, and what you're doing here is you're paralyzing an operation. Or part of it. In this case, she paralyzed the whole thing, and so the hospital could not access any of the medical records. So that's actually pretty significant. I badmouthed the NHS earlier, and as I said earlier, the National Health Service in the UK is having tremendous problems. But I'm going to also mention, do a dishonorable mention first, because Psych, they lost 4.6 million records about 3 or 4 weeks ago on a backup drive. And it's interesting I'm going to start with the Psych one. It's interesting to read the press release on that, because the way they write the press release tells you a lot about what's going on. In this case, they wrote up to 4.6 million records, which tells you they don't know how many were actually stolen. Whereas if a press release says it was 4,683,412, okay, then you know that they know what's going on. And they have at least some precision. But in the case of the NHS, what this highlights is the problem of exposing backup data. In this case, they're backing up data and keeping it on CD-ROMs. In this case, they lost 1.6 million records. Everything on there, very comprehensive information. Addresses, dates of birth, NHS numbers, general practice, I forgot what GP stands for, but basically it referred to the types of procedures that the specific people were having.
That's the sick codes, that's the health codes, that's what's wrong with them. They get treated for a bad ear and a broken leg or whatever. Yeah.
So this highlighted the problem with improperly securing backup data. So everyone has tapes or CD-ROMs that they try to store data on. This case, what they did is they put it on a CD-ROM and they didn't bother to encrypt it. It turns out also Psych didn't bother to encrypt that data as well. And so that 4.6 million records was actually open. So in this case, unencrypted data sits on tapes and disks and what have you. We see this a lot with, in the past, this is actually what helped, in many ways, helped give rise to DLP, where something gets lost and you lose a huge amount of sensitive information. The NHS has been notorious for this, and they're actually really, really under the microscope in the UK. This is this is a relatively minor breach in an obscure part of the UK, but it's a very, very interesting one. And it was a year and a half ago. The Imperva folks know this well, but we put out a study on the most commonly used password, 123456, and actually that study actually managed to make the front page of the New York Times. And that story still continues to get so much traction and so much coverage in the press because everyone has a password. It's very personal, and passwords are near and dear. One of our SEs in the federal space, he went and visited a customer a day or two after that story, and without even asking, one of the customers that he was working with said, "Oh, I saw that article yesterday in the New York Times about passwords. I have to admit, I was one of those stupid passwords. And we had to go through and change all of our passwords because this guy was running late for a meeting. That's why he was running late. So he gave the password excuse as the reason." So anyways, in this particular case, in the Bay School in the UK, a student managed to hack in and figured out the passwords for the website. They used the same passwords for the databases. So he was able, the student was able to go inside and get all the information, all the student information, because very simple, same password here, same password there. So here you have an example of weak passwords. Very simple, not a particularly muscular or strong way of doing an attack, but it was really a very simple thing to do to avoid. Okay. And then last, which I make a tie for number one, Sony and the government military websites. Now, the problem is you guys have already seen part of this because I gave away the screenshot earlier. But the point here is I'm trying to put up and play up the role of SQL injection. If you go to Privacy Rights again and you count up all of the lost records from 2005 till today, there was almost about 850 breaches, 315 million records stolen. This is from hacking, okay, from hacking alone, not necessarily taking data or something like a lost laptop or something like that. 83% of the time, SQL injection was involved. And for the life of me, I don't understand why SQL injection doesn't get the type of airplay it should, because it is probably the most damaging vulnerability in the history of computing. Forget buffer overflow. Buffer overflow had its day, but SQL injection is where it's at today. And so, in this case, now you guys saw this before, but in this case, SQL injection actually gave rise to a business. And I talked to you about how he was selling access to all these sites. So that's the reason this came about in January of this year, and that's the reason why I include it, because there's actually a very good perspective that came from Brian Krebs on this. He actually took our blog and reposted it on his own site, and he said something really interesting. Amid all of the media and public fascination with threats like Stuxnet and waiting terms like cyber war, it's easy to overlook the more humdrum and persistent security threats such as website vulnerabilities. But none of these distractions should excuse U.S. military leaders from making sure their websites aren't trivially hackable by script kiddies. And perfect summary. I can't really improve on that other than to say, let's not get too fascinated with APT. APT is an important thing, but let's get the basics down first. And so this particular incident with the government websites getting hacked is really good for two things. One, SQL injection shows how it's really become an industry in and of itself. And two, sometimes it's just a basic blocking and tackling. Okay, and then lastly is Sony themselves. This came out in April of this year. As I said earlier, it was 100 million with 12 unencrypted credit card information. Financial impact, $172 million and counting. Another point of impact is there's a marketing company that does branding and measures brand value. And they give you a brand value score. So Intel and Coca-Cola have very high brand name recognition. Sony's brand value dropped threefold. They went from like a rating of a 24 to a rating of an 8, according to the system, in the space of about 1 month. So that gives you also a very interesting data point. But in this case, SQL injection takes down a company. And I think it was also interesting is just how it really reached the CEO level. And this is a more updated chart of the stock price as well. Now again, market's been terribly volatile, so it's
Rob, before you go, this is the Sony chart,
this is pure Sony.
and this is 2011.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. So SQL injection. You insert an unauthorized SQL statement. I'm actually giving a webinar on this in a little while, and then you're gonna explain that quite a bit. So I actually unfortunately have to rush through this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about best practices for avoiding some of these issues. That's what I'm going to leave you with, so that you can have, your world will be like this paradise that you see right here. Here's an actual picture I took. I was on vacation with a family in Jamaica, and that's like my favorite picture. Okay, step 1, to secure it, you have to know it. So data discovery, classification are really, really important. You have to know what you don't know. Don't trust native database security tools. They're just not robust enough. They're not strong enough. Oracle is trying to make up for that. And other companies, IBM, etc. They're working on it as well, but they're not pure security companies. They don't think in terms of a security, so it's just not going to work. Profiling. It's not just for law enforcement anymore. What we did on our website, we wrote a blog, a huge blog. I mean, it's almost a book. In several parts, and what we did is we profiled 8 or 9 different types of individuals and what their motivations are from an insider threat standpoint, so that you can understand when, how, and where somebody might actually be tempted to actually suck down data that they shouldn't be doing, or sucking down information they shouldn't be having access to. And this is an important thing, and in fact, what a lot of companies, smarter companies, do is they, I think somebody mentioned this earlier, about working with HR to understanding, somebody's been drinking a little bit more lately, or somebody might be having some hard times, that type of thing. You need to understand those types of things. Institute security awareness training. This T-shirt is from Las Vegas that says, "What happens in Las Vegas stays on Facebook and YouTube forever." Knowing, I can't understate the importance of security awareness training. So. If people know what the rules are, if people know what security issues are, they will start paying attention to them and be a little bit more diligent about it. I'll give you one example. The security people at Honeywell do a really, really smart thing. In order to teach people on security within the organization, what they do is they give a 2-hour training course. Part 1, first hour, is personal security. What you should be doing online when you're at home with your kids, that type of thing. So it gives them a personal motivation. And then hour number 2 is, how do you make Honeywell a more secure place? And that's sort of the trade-off. We'll take 2 hours of your time, but you're going to walk out a better employee and a better consumer as well. And it goes over really, really well. I actually take it to a next level. I actually do this for my kids' schools, and I'm really proud to say that I got everyone in my school district off of Internet Explorer, and they're all using Chrome right now.
All right.
Implementing secure backup and recovery processes, encrypting. That's all pretty straightforward, or you would think, until people don't encrypt it, like Site didn't. Enforcing separation of duties and least privileges. Basically, this is referring to user rights. I mean, this is one of the most simple things to do, and just but the problem is a lot of tools don't have the ability to parse things properly. This is one of the things that I think you'll see in one of our demos, but it's a really important thing to do. Getting granular with access control lists. near our house, I live in East Bay, and near San Francisco. There's a college, Diablo Valley College, community college. They had 11 or 12 people who had the ability to change grades. And so what ended up happening is a couple of those people would take bribes from students to change their grades. Those people didn't need access. My wife is she's a registrar at the School of Law at Berkeley. And she has the only ability to change grades. So they've got it very, very, very streamlined, and that's the right way to do it. Log, monitor, and audit employee actions. So my wife gets monitored every time that she tries to change a grade. And then it has to get approved by somebody else and so forth. So there's a whole process for that kind of thing. And I think going back to our customer signature of, in God I trust, for everyone else I keep log files is important. Anticipating managing negative workplace issues. I mentioned working with HR on what might be happening within the organization. Being extra cautious with sysadmins and technically privileged users. One thing that some of you might be aware of is, a DBA can create a temporary account, then log in under that temporary account, suck down a bunch of data, and then delete that temporary account. That's a pretty sophisticated thing fairly sophisticated, not a difficult thing to do. But you need to be able to know that somebody actually even attempted to do something like that. And then, IT and security need to understand, what are the potential risks of more technically advanced people, because those are the ones who can be especially damaging, as we saw with Societe Generale. Password management, strict password management policies. I think Twitter did a good job. They blacklisted a bunch of passwords. So in fact, if you go to skullsecurity.org, you can download a bazillion passwords. But they also have certain passwords that Twitter has made illegal to use as part of their password list. And I think that's a good one. Although I'm finding right now, people are getting a lot more clever about their passwords. So instead of doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they'll do !QAZ at WSX. So if you look at your keyboards, you'll just notice that's your keyboard's going down in a specific sequence. But so you have to be clever about those kinds of things as well. Okay. Resource control mechanisms. So basically, this is looking at things that like automation, automated attacks, because if certain people are accessing things in a way that a human cannot, then that should tell you, okay, that's something a little bit weird. So for example, the way a virus might try to break into a password, there's certain click rates and things like that that would seem unnatural for a human. Okay. Consider application insider threats from an application standpoint. So you have a lot of internal applications, for example, HR, submitting expense reports. There was a problem with PeopleSoft systems where if you were writing your expenses, you could actually look at the expenses of all your other employees. And in one case, it was found out that in one company, the CEO was taking trips from California to Manhattan every weekend on a private jet and expensing $10,000 a weekend for it. Caused a lot of, in this case, justifiable anger with the CEO for doing something like that. And then lastly, and this goes back to the SQL injection thing especially, but WAF and pen testing. I mean, it's such a no-brainer. Put a WAF up, protect it. If you use a vulnerability scanner like a white hat or something like that, integrate the two. Hammer the application until the WAF is tuned that nothing can get through, at least using that particular thing. And remember, it's a question of, in the case of application security, is just being secure enough that the hackers, the bad guys, want to move on. Because if it's too much work, they're not going to waste their time with you.
And the WAF stands for WAF?
Web App Firewall, sorry. Web Application Firewall.
Thank you.
Yeah. And on that note, if you want these slides, just send me your credit card number, mother's maiden name, and an email, and I'll be happy to send you a copy. Although I think they're going to get posted up to some internal website here as well. So, all right. Thank you. I have to scoot.
Rob, great job. Thank you very much. We certainly appreciate it. And in the hustle and the bustle of things, I know you're headed to